Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have you here, and thanks for spending your Wednesdays with us. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads program. There could not be a more interesting week for tonight's program. We are thrilled to present once again Congressman Adam Schiff, who tonight will be in conversation with Warren Olney. We want to remind you all that in our emails this week, which we have sent to you, we have provided the link to Congressman Schiff's new best-selling book, Midnight in Washington. It was just released, and if you haven't gotten your copy yet, you don't want to miss out on what just became #1 on the New York Times bestsellers list. So be sure to get your copy after our program tonight, if you don't already have it. We like to remind you each week of the mission of this America at a Crossroads series, namely to provide programs which inspire us to stay informed, engaged, strong, and motivated as we strive to protect and shore up the foundations of our fragile democracy and its institutions. Full unedited recordings of all of our 84 programs to date can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website. An easy-to-use link is in each and every one of our emails so that you can watch these programs at your leisure or rewatch them if you've already seen them once. A lot of people say that they like to go back and review it afterwards. Our judge leadership team includes former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazen. And you saw our list of co-sponsors on the screen a moment ago. We are all grateful to our co-sponsors. Next week, we will host an amazing duo of probably the two most experienced and astute political pundits around, Stephen Schmidt and Robert Shrum. We hope you'll join us. Please register early. And if you aren't getting the Zoom links, it's because you probably either purposely or accidentally unsubscribed from our lists. You can go to our website to re-register. If you have any problems with that, you can send me an email and I'll help you out. The week after Steve Schmidt and Robert Shrum is Congressman James Clyburn from South Carolina. It should be a very interesting program. He'll be interviewed by Larry Mantle. Now, my terrific colleague, longtime friend, legendary LA political figure, and a terrific person, Zev Yaroslavsky, will share a bit more about others of our upcoming programs. Zev?
Thank you very much, Janice. And on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates and its chair, very able chair, David Lehrer, I am pleased to welcome you to America at a Crossroads virtual town halls, where tonight we have nearly 6,000 people registered with us. I want to give you an update on a couple of an eclectic mix of upcoming provocative and informative speakers, from the Washington Post insightful op-ed columnist Max Boot to Michigan's Governor Gretchen Whitmer, who has been dealing with extremist threats for some time in her home state of Michigan, to world-renowned geographer, historian, ornithologist, and best-selling author, UCLA professor Jared Diamond. Diamond will discuss one of the subjects of his most recent book, Upheaval: Whether Nations Learn Lessons from Trauma. Keep your eyes out for on our registration links for the exact programs and times, and you will receive those links within the week. Our guest tonight, my good friend Congressman Adam Schiff, will be introduced by my longtime friend and colleague, former Congressman and community leader and member of the Judge Executive Committee, Mel Levine. And by the way, let me just give an endorsement to Adam's book, Midnight in Washington. I've been reading it and I literally can't put it down. Congratulations on that book, Congressman. So now let me turn it over to you, Mel. It's all yours.
Thank you, Zev. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and Janice and David once again. And it's a special pleasure to be able to introduce Congressman Adam Schiff. Congressman Schiff, at this point in his career, and particularly in light of what he's been up to in the last several years, really needs no introduction. So I'm going to dispense with his long list of accomplishments, many of which are already well known. He has long been my ideal of a public servant: smart, honest, highly capable, and highly effective. And also, he doesn't take himself too seriously. I'm confident that his particularly Democratic colleagues will be looking to him for even more guidance and direction than they have in the past in light of last night's humbling experiences. I, for one, am grateful, and I believe we are all very fortunate that Adam has dedicated his life to public service and that he chairs the House Intelligence Committee and serves on the January 6th committee. I also want to mention his new book, Midnight in Washington, which I could not put down either. It's both a page turner and an extraordinarily important, in my view, chronicle of what led to and occurred at the two Trump impeachments. And we greatly appreciate Adam's repeat appearances with us, including tonight. Adam will be interviewed by Warren Olney, who also needs no introduction to Southern Californians due to his long and distinguished tenure at KCRW, or to this audience where we are grateful and fortunate that Warren has regularly moderated our events. Among his numerous awards are being the only two-time winner of the Los Angeles Society of Professional Journalists Distinguished Journalist Award, as well as being honored with a Lifetime Achievement Award by the Radio and Television News Association of Southern California. Warren, I lateral it over to you.
Mel, thank you very much for that kind introduction. And Congressman, welcome to you. It's great to have you and be on the same program once again.
Warren, thank you so much for moderating the discussion tonight. I'm a great admirer of yours, so it's a pleasure to be on the virtual stage with you. And thank you to Mel and Zev and Janice. This is really just an extraordinary forum, and I've enjoyed being with you before and look forward to tonight.
I also want to welcome the audience and to tell you that toward the end of the program, I'll be getting emails with your questions for Congressman Schiff, and I will ask them when the appropriate moment arrives. If I can get my phone fixed up for it, I think I can. Congressman, in the past few days and weeks, there's just been a torrent of information coming out about the last days of the Trump administration, and that's principally what your book is about, although it's not all that it's about. But I wonder, since all of this is coming out, since your book was written and published, what's the main reason that people should read it now? And how do you hope it will help them understand what's going on at the moment, or what's being revealed?
I think we have, Warren, enough perspective now. That is, the events that I write about over the last predominantly 4 or 5 years are still close, but they're far enough where we can gain some understanding of the arc of this recent and terrible history. And in very broad outline, we saw in 2016 the Russians intervene to help choose a president of the United States with a massive social media campaign, with a hacking and dumping scheme. And we saw the former president encourage that help in the election, make an effort to coordinate with the Russians, and lie to cover it up. And when the president escaped accountability for that, you can draw a direct line from that escape of accountability to engaging even worse conduct with respect to Ukraine, where he withheld hundreds of millions of dollars from an ally at war to coerce that ally into helping him cheat in the election. And when he escaped accountability yet again in that first impeachment trial, you can draw another straight line to even worse behavior with respect to the 2020 election and incitement of a violent insurrection. And people need to understand that that line continues and the danger that he continues to pose to this country going forward. So I tried to tell the story in this book, not of what happened in the Trump White House, which is well known, but what happened in Congress and how it was that so many people that I worked came to enable that kind of corrupt and immoral conduct, because without his enablers in Congress, the degree to which Donald Trump tore down our democratic institutions never could have taken place. And that's a story people need to be aware of.
I want to hear more about that. I know our listeners do as well, our viewers, I should say, do as well. But the early part of the book deals with your life before politics, and you say that it prepared me unknowingly for a national trial that was to come. Tell us some of the incidents that are the most significant in that context.
Well, probably a couple I would point to in particular. One was as an assistant U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, I was given the responsibility of trying the first FBI agent ever indicted for espionage, Richard Miller, who spied effectively for the Soviet Union, was giving an asset of the KGB named Svetlana Ogorodnikova. For some reason, Warren, they always turn out to be named Svetlana, essentially sex for secrets. I learned a lot in that early trial back in the 1980s, 1990s about Russian tradecraft, how they target people who are of poor morals, who are philanderers, who are consumed with greed. I would recognize certain aspects of Russian tradecraft many decades later that I was not expecting to, but were grounded in my experience in that original spy case. The other experience I had that was, I think, very pertinent to the present is I spent half a year while I was with the Justice Department in Eastern Europe, in Czechoslovakia in particular, where I watched in a matter of months a xenophobic populist named Vladimir Mečiar literally tear the country apart. When I arrived in early 1992 in Czechoslovakia, there was no expectation the country would divide. But I got to see just how potent that kind of ugly nativism is. The effort to blame others for economic conditions, in the case of Mečiar, to blame the Czechs, to blame the Hungarian-speaking population, to blame the Romani population, and just how skillful that could be used to literally tear the country apart. And that too would be instructive in the years ahead.
You said a moment ago that some of the people in Congress enabled President Trump to do what he did. You also say that in your early life and much of your political life, you were bipartisan. You were born bipartisan. You tried to conduct yourself that way, but in the book, in great detail, full of anecdotes and rich with quotations, you are scathing about the honesty and the integrity of people by name. Devin Nunes is one, the Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy is another. Do you have any hope of being able to work with them again as you go back as Congress reconvenes when this book says about them what it does?
Well, I wanted to be very candid about how it is that that people of good conscience can so quickly and so easily end up surrendering themselves, their ideas, their ideology, even their morality in the service of that corrupt and unethical president. Now, some of them, frankly, and I tell the story of Kevin McCarthy, were, of very, poor character well before Donald Trump entered the scene. And I tell the story about Kevin McCarthy because it's instructive, both as to a question I'm always asked by my constituents and others around the country, and that is, do the Republicans really believe what they're saying publicly? What do they say when they're in private? In very quick outline, the story involves my sitting next to Kevin McCarthy on an airplane, flying to Washington, D.C. back in 2010, when the midterms were still 6 months away. And we had an idle conversation about who would win the midterms. And I said the Democrats would win, and he said the Republicans were going to win. And we got to Washington, and I thought nothing of it. But unbeknownst to me, he went off and did a briefing for the press. And during the briefing, he told the press that Republicans were going to win the midterms. Everybody knew it. He sat next to Adam Schiff on the plane, and even Adam Schiff admitted that Republicans were going to win the midterms. This didn't come out until the morning. And when it did, I was beside myself. And I rushed up to him on the House floor and I said, Kevin, I would have thought if we're having a private conversation, it was a private conversation, but if it wasn't, you know that I said the exact opposite of what you told the press. And his answer was, yeah, I know, Adam, but you know how it goes. And in that respect, McCarthy was really born for a moment like this, when the leader of his party does not care about truth or right or wrong. It's all about what you need to do to win, what you need to say, what you need to do, and ethics be damned. That's an important story, I think, both in terms of answering that question, but also given that there is any possibility that he might become speaker one day. As to Devin Nunes, I'll just say in sum that notwithstanding our very pointed differences and our pointed criticisms going back and forth, we have managed to work together on the Intelligence Committee to this day, and each year pass our Intelligence Authorization Act, which is the product of a year's worth of oversight. So we've been able to compartmentalize, and I expect that that will continue.
You talk at one point about Devin Nunes looking at you with an utterly blank face. I'm sure you know the incident that I'm talking about. I don't want to try to describe it in great detail, but tell us more about that, because it's interesting, because you worked with him when he was the chair of the Intelligence Committee and you were the ranking member, the other way around from what it is now.
Well, Devin Nunes, and of course, with everyone, it's a different story. Devin Nunes did not begin as an ideologue. In fact, I describe him as kind of a John Boehner country club Republican. One of my favorite Devin Nunes expressions was during the Tea Party movement, when he described them as lemmings with suicide vests. So it wasn't that he began as an ideologue. He did get to know Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign when Trump was in the Central Valley. He was later asked by Trump to serve on the transition team. And when it became clear during the election, in the months leading up to the election, that the Russians were interfering in our election to try to help elect Donald Trump, and it fell to our committee to do the investigation, I think he wanted to both maintain that seat at Donald Trump's table and still somehow conduct an independent investigation, which would have been difficult under any circumstance, but it proved impossible for him. And it culminated in an incident called the Midnight Run, in which he disappeared in the middle of the late afternoon or late at night to go to an undisclosed location in which he represented that he had seen documents indicating some conspiracy of the Obama administration to surveil Donald Trump's campaign. He then went and proceeded to present these papers, these documents, to the White House. Well, we would soon learn within a matter of days that there was no whistleblower involved, that the documents he went to present to the White House, he had in fact gotten from the White House. And the whole thing was a charade. And when that happened, I questioned him about it. And how could he do this? And that's when I got that rather blank response. Ultimately, I had to call on him to step down, and he did. And certainly that was a relationship altering event. One that I took no pleasure in, but we couldn't conduct an impartial or objective investigation if he was still chairing it when he was engaged in conduct of that kind.
Okay, so Kevin McCarthy perhaps had a history of lacking integrity, if I can put it that way. Nunes not so much, and a lot of others not so much. And yet they are lockstep now in their effort to prevent really governance from happening and stopping the Biden administration in every way, not just in the House, but in the Senate as well. How did they get that way? And why do you think that is? You don't talk that much about what you think their motivations are, or how obviously they're all different people, but and perhaps there's a different story for each one. But is there a way to generalize about how this happened? That, after all, is the point of your book.
I think there is a way to generalize. And what I kept coming back to in the book was something that Robert Caro once wrote. He once wrote, actually, I think he said this in an interview, that power doesn't corrupt as much as it reveals. It doesn't always reveal us for our best, but it tells a lot about who we are. And for example, in the case of Bill Barr, I think power revealed him to be utterly willing to sacrifice the independence of the Justice Department, sacrifice his own integrity in the service of Donald Trump. When he served as Attorney General in the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, and was surrounded by people, I think, like the former president, who were of high character, it was one thing. But when he tethered himself to a man of low character, we saw what he was made of. But I think it's equally important, Warren, that I tell the story too of how power revealed other people to be of great character. If you look at Dan Coates, for example, former Republican senator of Indiana, became the head of the intelligence community, refused to carry Donald Trump's lies about Russia or North Korea, was willing to risk his job and lose it, and he did. He was a man of integrity. He showed that he could not be bullied. by Donald Trump or anyone else. I think Secretary Mattis the same way. Other people like former Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch showed herself to be of incredible courage, told not to testify by the State Department to which she was employed, but who obeyed a lawful subpoena. She had been hounded out of her post by the president's own smear campaign. She stood up to that. And I think she paved the way for others like Alexander Vindman, who I know has been on your program before, and others like Bill Taylor and Fiona Hill, among others. So power revealed a lot of people to be truly heroic, but it also revealed others to be less able to withstand the pull of ambition. One final point I would make, Warren, those who did reveal themselves to be lacking in the kind of character we would want in elected officials, the way that happened, frankly, was one small compromise at a time. They would be asked to do something or say something that they knew was wrong or marginally unethical, and they would do it, and then they would be asked to do something a little bit larger and a little bit more questionable, and they would rationalize it by saying that it was better that they stay in their position than that someone else have that position who would not be as circumspect. And one lie at a time, one compromise at a time, eventually they were so far in, there was no turning back. It tells us a lot about human nature, but one of the terrible epiphanies that I reached over the last 4 years was that the predominant threat to our democracy now comes from within, not from outside the country. And it comes from within because too few people in the Congress and who served in that administration were willing to give meaning to their oath of office.
Apropos of January 6th, you say we can reinforce the doors and we can put up fences, but we cannot guard our democracy against those who walk the halls of Congress, who've taken an oath to uphold the Constitution, but refuse to do so. Are you suggesting by that members of Congress actually enabled what happened on January 6th? You used that term earlier with regard to President Trump. But do you believe, you're now on the select committee investigating January 6th, that there were members of Congress who took an active role in organizing and implementing what happened that day?
Well, I think you've asked about a few different things. You've asked whether I believe that people enabled what took place on January 6th, and whether people took an active part in organizing that attack that day.
So there's a distinction there.
Yeah, there is, and I certainly believe that those in the GOP who have pushed the big lie, who have told their constituents and others around the country that the election was stolen from them, that it was rigged and marred by massive fraud. Yes, they have enabled that attack to take place. And to the degree that they continue to push that big lie after seeing the violence that it brought, the responsibility is even greater. Now, whether others were involved in the actual planning or participated, for example, there are allegations that some may have led tours of insurrectionists before that day to help acquaint them with the layout of the Capitol. That I don't know. That we're investigating, and I am not going to prejudge it. But I'll tell you, I was there on January 6th for the entire attack on the Capitol. I had suggested to the speaker that we form a small group to prepare for whatever might go wrong in the election. What if the Electoral College was tied? What if a state sent 2 slates of electors? What if the vice president refused to recognize the slate of electors? And we anticipated just about everything that might go wrong, except, of course, what did go wrong with the violent attack on the Capitol. But as a result of working on that, I was asked to help manage the debate on the floor. And, I was there for the initial breach and the effort to break the doors and windows to get into our chamber. And I remember a couple of Republicans coming up to me because I waited behind as others were exiting the chamber and told me, "You can't let them see you. I know these people." One of the Republicans said, I can talk my way through these people. You're in a wholly different category." And and my first reaction was to feel, kind of touched by their evident concern for me. But my next feeling was that if they hadn't been lying about the election, or me for that matter, I wouldn't need to be worried about my safety. None of us would. And in the days that follow, I have to say that sentiment, that anger at what I've described as the insurrectionists in suits and ties, did nothing but grow, because it grew with the realization that those outside the chamber who were breaking windows to get in believed the big lie. But the people that I served with inside the chamber, they knew it was a big lie. And even after that attack, while there was still blood on the floor outside the chamber, they were back on the floor, still trying to overturn the election. And to me, that is unforgivable.
Can you just reflect for a moment and tell us a bit about the kinds of emotions that went through your mind, the kinds of feelings that you had when you were in the Capitol and it was attacked in that way?
Well, I remember the first time I recognized something was going wrong. I had not been paying attention to what was going on down the mall because I was speaking on the floor. I was listening to the Republican arguments to overturn the election and preparing my rebuttals. And I looked up from my notes at some point and I saw that the speaker was no longer in her chair, which struck me as odd because I knew from our preparations she intended to preside the whole time of the joint session come hell or high water. And the next thing I knew, two Capitol Police rushed onto the floor and grabbed our number 2, Steny Hoyer, and whisked him off the floor so fast that I remember thinking to myself, I've never seen Steny move that fast. And then they came back on the floor in rapid succession to tell us increasingly bleak assessments of the situation, that there were rioters in the building, that we needed to get out our gas masks, which really weren't masks as much as they were hoods, a polyethylene bag that you pulled over your head that had a elastic band around your neck. And the idea of pulling a bag over my head that way, even though I had a fan to circulate the air, had my pulse racing, and I determined not to put the thing on until I could smell tear gas or needed to. But when you took those out, it immediately started these fans buzzing, and suddenly the chamber was filled with the sound of what seemed like angry hornets. And finally the Capitol Police said we needed to get out. And this was the point where it was really quite jammed getting out of the chamber, and I hung back and had that conversation with a couple of the Republicans. When I did ultimately walk out, I walked out with a Republican who was holding a wooden post in his hands. We had hand sanitizer on wooden posts so that when you walked into the chamber, you could clean your hands. And he had ripped it out of the floor and was holding it to use as a bludgeon if he needed to protect himself. And I asked him if he was that worried about his safety. And he said that he was, that he thought that he had just heard gunshots. And I think that was when Ashley Babbitt was shot. And I saw he was wearing a member pin, but I didn't recognize him. And I asked him how long he'd been in Congress. And his answer just startled me because his answer was 72 hours. And I said, 72 hours? And he said, yes, I just got elected. And I've kind of a dark sense of humor and didn't know quite what else to respond. And I looked at him and in deadpan, I just said, it's not always like this. We walked out together and headed off to a secure location. And I think it was one of those traumatic incidents, and which I guess is not uncommon, where the trauma grows over time. This was particularly so, I think, for members of Congress, because inside the chamber, we could hear the crowd, but we couldn't tell how big it was or how violent it was until we saw the images in the days that followed of just how many thousands were there and how badly they were beating and gouging and bear spraying and attacking the police. And we got a really more vivid sense of just how lucky we were that we had these incredible police officers protecting us.
You were able to get off a great line, but didn't it just scare the hell out of you?
You know, I suppose everyone responds differently to that kind of a situation. I had a hard time believing it was really happening. Um, and uh, and so it was harrowing, certainly, but I think my predominant reaction was just, maybe it was just one of being shocked that this could really happen in this country. And I spend, a great deal of time on the Intelligence Committee working with others around the world and interacting with foreign parliamentarians and foreign heads of other intelligence services. And I also couldn't help but be mortified at how this was making our country appear in the eyes of the world. We're in a vigorous competition around the world right now, a competition over autocracy versus democracy. The autocrats are on the rise. Around the world right now, China is touting its model as being superior to democracy because it can deliver prosperity and law and order. And it is holding up that attack with people literally climbing on top of the Capitol as Exhibit A. But people need to make no mistake about the China model. Their model is totalitarianism. But we also have to recognize, and this is really one of the main points that I wrote this book, our democracy is fragile, more fragile than ever. And for a whole generation that grew up in the wake of World War II, where we thought that democracy was inexorable, with more countries and more people living in free societies with free press and able to choose their own leaders, and somehow this was immutable. It's not inexorable at all. We're going to have to fight for it, as previous generations did. We're going to have to make the case anew, because the idea of democracy is very much under assault.
It's been reported that it took the then president, 187 minutes, I think it was, more than 3 hours before he actually tried to do something to stop what was going on, even though his daughter was among those who were advocating that he do so. The Intelligence Committee that you're on, the Select Committee investigating January 6th, may well go out of business if the Congress changes hands. Last night's election suggests that there's more evidence than there had been that might actually happen. Are you working fast enough on the committee? Do you think you can get it done? Will you be able to resolve the kinds of doubts that exist in the minds of the American people before the committee just simply can't function anymore because the Republicans have taken over?
We are moving with enormous expedition. So the answer is yes. We are moving very quickly. Much of that the public hasn't been able to see yet because we're doing interviews and depositions almost every day. We've had one public hearing. We'll be doing a lot more public hearings. Our practice in this investigation, as it was my practice in the Ukraine investigation and the Russia investigation, was to do private interviews and depositions to be followed by public hearings. The depositions and interviews are part of the fact-finding process. The public hearings are part of the educating the public process. So there's a natural progression to them. But in the case, for example, of Steve Bannon, where we have run into a roadblock, we have moved with great speed to hold people in criminal contempt and to refer them for prosecution. So we're moving very quickly. And there are some things that are not completely within our control. Donald Trump is once again trying to stonewall in the courts. I think criminal prosecutions, if and when the Justice Department brings a case against Steve Bannon, which I hope and expect them to do shortly, that will concentrate the mind of other witnesses who will not want to be prosecuted themselves. So we're moving with great expedition. I will say that in terms of your question also, will we be able to make the case to the American people? We're going to do a thorough investigation. We're going to make those findings public. We're going to show the American people what we find through these hearings. Will that be enough to convince everyone? No, not everyone. One of my colleagues, Mike Quigley, I think of Chicago, put it better than I ever could when he observed recently that it used to be people would say, I'll believe it when I see it. Now it's more, I won't even see it until I'm ready to believe it. You can show people footage of the insurrectionists that day beating police officers. But if they're not ready to see it, if they're only willing to believe Donald Trump and his falsehoods about this being a normal tourist day, or falsehoods of my colleagues in Congress who are suggesting that, that's very difficult. But I do believe that there is a core group of Americans who continue to have an open mind and be open to the facts. And that's who we need to reach. I think we have been able to reach that core group in the past, and for that reason, they rejected another 4 years of the kind of anti-democratic conduct that we saw in the former president. And the best we can do is the best that we can do, and we're doing it.
If you can't reach them, if the Congress changes hands in 2022, and Kevin McCarthy becomes the speaker, the man who said, that's the way it goes, when he lied about your private conversation. Will you still want to be in Congress?
I will want to be in Congress for the same reason that I wanted to be in Congress the previous 4 years, which is our democracy is at a fragile moment. And I think that any of us that are in a position to help defend it right now will have to do our duty. But I'll tell you, it will be a very hard slog. Were Kevin McCarthy ever to become speaker, effectively, Donald Trump would be the speaker, because Kevin McCarthy will not stand up to Donald Trump in any way. Had Kevin McCarthy been speaker in 2020, had we lost a few more seats in the House in that presidential election, Kevin McCarthy would have overturned the election in the House, and we would have been in a complete constitutional crisis. And so he will certainly make the January 6th Select Committee go away. After all, Donald Trump didn't want the commission established to begin with. We will have concluded our work by then, so that much I'm very confident of. But if we are forced to endure another 4 years of Donald Trump as president, this country and its democracy will look nothing like it does today.
Let me ask you some questions that have been forwarded to David by the audience. It's only fair that they get to be heard. Here's a question. How is it like to work with Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger on the January 6th committee?
This is, again, one of those bright lights, which is the fact that on the January 6th committee, there is no daylight among Democrats and Republicans. We are all determined to get to the truth and to do so with great vigor and overcome any obstacles put in our way. That's certainly my view. It's the view of every member of the Select Committee. And I have to say that I think that what Liz Cheney is doing and Adam Kinzinger is tremendously courageous. And I would point to this one comparison to tell you all you need to know about Robert Caro's maxim and where we are right now. Liz Cheney refused to carry a big lie that undermines our democracy. She proved to be a person of character, and she was willing to lose her position in Republican leadership in order to maintain her devotion to our democracy and uphold her oath. Elise Stefanik, on the other hand, said that basically when Liz Cheney said, "I won't carry the big lie, even if it means I lose my position," Elise Stefanik raised her hand and said, "I'll carry it." And she has. And in that contrast between those two members, Elise Stefanik and Liz Cheney, you see a lot in microcosm about the different nature of members of Congress today.
Stephen wants to know, what do you think about the possibility of voter suppression in 2024?
I think the gravest danger facing our democracy right now is these efforts to disenfranchise people, particularly people of color, the use of the big lie basically to usher in a whole new generation of Jim Crow laws. But I also think equally dangerous is the effort around the country to strip independent elections officials of their duties and give them over to partisans who will carry out the will of Donald Trump. And what I mean by that is If the lesson that Donald Trump and the GOP apparently took away from the failed insurrection and the failed effort to overturn the election in 2020 is if they couldn't get Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State in Georgia, to find 11,780 votes that don't exist, they seem determined to make sure there's someone in that position and in others around the country who would be willing to stuff the ballot box, as Donald Trump was evidently demanding. That to me is the gravest risk that we face. First, that there's a vigorous effort to disenfranchise people, to determine the outcome of an election by making it more difficult for people of color to vote. And second, that if that is unsuccessful and they still lose the election, they're trying to position themselves so that the election can be overturned. And this really is how democracies come to an end. It's not always by violent means. If there's another attack on the Capitol, it will fail like the last one. But where they could succeed is in using the instruments of democracy to tear down democracy itself. That's what we've seen in places like Hungary. It's what we're witnessing in places like Poland. And it's what's being attempted here in the United States of America.
What do you think are the chances? I believe I'm correct in saying that today the Senate again has turned down the Voting Rights Act, named for the great late civil rights leader. What do you think are the chances of getting that passed? And if it's not passed, what are the risks?
I think there is a narrow lane that remains to get that done, to get the John Lewis voting rights bill passed, to get HR 1 passed, that is a whole series of democratic reforms that would take aim at the gerrymander, for example. That lane, that narrow lane, runs through Joe Manchin. There's no way to get that done without Joe Manchin's support. And I think what it requires is the intensive personal effort of the President of the United States to work with Joe Manchin. And I would hope that these efforts, by taking these bills up in the Senate and having them voted down, will demonstrate to Joe Manchin Republicans will never support an effort to attack gerrymandering or disenfranchisement, because disenfranchisement is now the Republican political business model. They realize, I think, that their ideas are outdated and increasingly unpopular, that their base is shrinking, and over time they're going to be a dinosaur unless they can prohibit people from voting. And so there is a narrow lane to do it. What's the consequence if we don't get it done? If there's another vigorous round of gerrymandering, if the filibuster remains intact, what it means is that we will continue to have minority rule in this country that is ruled by a minority of Americans. With the gerrymander, the House for much of a decade is controlled by a party that lost the popular vote. In the Senate, where rural areas, 23% of the population control 60% of the vote, it's already a minority-based institution. The filibuster only makes it more so. And with the Electoral College, the presidency itself is often a minority institution because we often have presidents who lose the popular vote. The Supreme Court itself is the most minority-based, least representative body in our government. And we have to ask ourselves, how long can a democracy survive, let alone thrive, if a minority continues to run the country? And the danger is that a democracy doesn't survive that way. And so these are not just procedural reforms. They're integral, I think, to the protection of our democracy.
How important are the courts?
Well, the courts are enormously important. And I find myself in a position I never would have imagined, which is supporting an expansion of the court. Because I never would have imagined a Senate leader like Mitch McConnell doing the destruction that he did by withholding a nominee for a year from a Democratic president and then jamming through a nominee in the last few weeks of a Republican president. That effectuated a 2-justice shift on the court that will otherwise have a generational impact. In my view, expanding the size of the court by 2 justices is not stacking the court, it's unstacking it. Otherwise, I fear that we're going to have another generation that will grow up under a Supreme Court that is increasingly unrepresentative of the country and adhering to not a conservative constitutional ideology, but a partisan one.
How likely is that to happen, though, given the makeup of the Congress? At the moment, the Congress would have to do that and is, in fact, enabled to do that, as I understand it. Pardon me.
Well, two things would be required. First, we would need the president's support, and that's by no means a guarantee. But beyond that, we would also need to expand. I think we're going to need to expand the number of Democrats in the Senate for that to happen. Because I cannot see Joe Manchin allowing an exception to the filibuster to unstack the Supreme Court, notwithstanding the fact that Mitch McConnell carved out an exception to the filibuster in order to stack it. In terms of the two bills that we're working on right now, the Build Back Better bill and the voting and the infrastructure bill, we will get these passed, I'm confident, but there won't be everything in it that we would like. The answer to that conundrum, the answer to that difficulty is we're going to need to expand the majority in the Senate, and we're going to need to cling tenaciously to the majority in the House to make those things happen.
It's going to take a while.
Well, look, it could be as soon as the next midterm. And I'll tell you, Warren, one of the things that gives me optimism, notwithstanding the gloomy night we had last night, is that there are two historic precedents at work here. One is in Virginia and New Jersey, in which the president in power in their first term always loses those two races. They were lost by George Herbert Walker Bush, by Bill Clinton, by George W. Bush, by Barack Obama, and Donald Trump. And indeed, the only one to break the rule so far has been Joe Biden in winning the governor's race in New Jersey. But the different precedent in the midterms.
Joe Biden, he was not the one who won the race in New Jersey.
Yes, I mean under a Biden presidency. So
Okay.
I'm giving him some credit for that. Okay. If we're going to give him some blame for Virginia, we need to give him some credit for New Jersey. But in the midterms, we've already had our correction in the House of Representatives. We lost seats in Joe Biden's election. Normally, you would gain seats and then you would lose them 2 years later. Well, we already lost those seats. So I'm confident that the House race for the majority is going to be very close and winnable for us, but nothing by any means to take for granted.
Howard wants to know, what is the likelihood of former President Trump being held culpable of misconduct in some venue somewhere?
I'm not particularly optimistic, to be candid, and this is an area where I don't concur with the approach of the Justice Department, or at least what I perceive as the view of the Justice Department. And by that, I mean, I think that the Justice Department needs to investigate any serious allegation of criminal activity by Donald Trump. And I'm not sure that's happening, because I think, Warren, if you or I or anyone who's listening tonight were on the phone in a tape recorded conversation demanding that a Secretary of State find 11,780 votes that don't exist, essentially demand that that secretary defraud the voters of that state, I think we would be under investigation, and we should be. But I don't see any sign that that's happening. And, while I appreciate the sentiment of not wanting to look backward, I am more concerned, frankly, with the idea after Nixon and the pardon of Nixon and the last 4 years, when the Justice Department took the position erroneously, I believe, that you cannot investigate or prosecute a sitting president, that if the current administration takes the position, or the current Justice Department, that not only can you not prosecute a sitting president, that as a practical matter, you can't prosecute a former president either, because you don't want to look backward, then the president does become above the law. And that is a very dangerous idea. And more particularly dangerous since the last president wants to be president again. And that gets back to our first comments, and that is that straight line from the effort to cheat in 2016 with Russian help, to the effort to cheat with Ukraine in 2020, to the effort to overturn the election and incitement of insurrection later in 2020 and 2021, to the future. And so I believe the Justice Department ought to be vigorously investigating that. I believe the Justice Department should be pursuing individual number one in the Southern District of New York, And I'm concerned that the local Fulton County District Attorney in Georgia, for example, does not have the resources to take on the magnitude of that challenge.
So we've talked about this before, and you've just done it, but Philip wants to know, do you think that Merrick Garland's Department of Justice will back up the subpoenas of the House? And let me go further and say, do you think he'll do anything beyond that to try to hold the president accountable?
Yes to the first, and I'm not confident on the second. I'm optimistic that the Justice Department will prosecute Steve Bannon. And I say that because as we have tried to interview top Justice Department officials from the former Trump years, the current Justice Department is not standing in the way. They're not asserting any kind of executive privilege. Indeed, in the documents we're trying to get from the National Archives for the former administration, they have made it very clear the Biden administration is not going to assert executive privilege. And I think, both the Justice Department and the White House understand that they're setting a precedent here that will affect them too down the road. But they also understand the importance of getting information to Congress and the American people about what led to that attack on the seat of our government. And they're not going to stand in the way. And should they decline to present to the grand jury what we have referred in Steve Bannon's case, effectively, they would be sending a message to all those who wish to thwart Congress that you can do so with impunity. And I cannot believe that the Garland Justice Department would subscribe to that diminution of our system of checks and balances and that invitation to disrule, because that's what it would mean.
You speak in the book about Senator Feinstein and how you worked with her in various ways. It's a very positive account of the relationship that you have. Judy wants to know, would you be interested in running for Dianne Feinstein's seat if in fact she vacated it?
That's something I would be interested in. I'm not prepared to make any announcement because the senator won't be retiring for another 3.5 years. But it is something I considered in the past. It would be something I would consider again. But what I have discovered, Warren, in this job is we can do all the thinking and foreseeing possible, and fate makes fools of all of us. So I'm in a line of work that is very difficult to predict. The only good advice I have is what I got from my father, who told me when I was a kid, if you're good at what you do, there will always be a demand for you, which was a very liberating idea, because then I just had to try to be good at what I'm doing. And I'm going to continue trying to be good at what I'm doing and let the future take care of itself.
Great advice and counsel. Lynn wants to know, back to the issue of whether some of your colleagues are found to have colluded. Do you think, hang on a minute, I lost that question. Do you think that anything will happen to them if they are found to have done so?
Well, we are going to follow the evidence wherever it leads on the January 6th committee. If it leads to fellow members of Congress, then we're going to follow the evidence there, and we'll expose any complicity in the events of that day. Now, what will happen if there is complicity will depend on the seriousness of it. It will be up to the Justice Department, not Congress, to determine whether anyone has broken a criminal law and should be prosecuted. But Congress, though, has other powers it can use, ranging from a censure to expulsion from the House. So we do have certain remedies, and I won't prejudge, as I mentioned earlier, what remedy there may be available, because we need to explore the facts and find out what culpability there might be. But I can't tell you this, on a very bipartisan, nonpartisan basis, all of us on the committee, including our conservative Republicans, are determined to expose any misconduct by anyone connected to January 6th.
Several people have asked about what happened yesterday in Virginia, particularly. And Barbara is Sue is the most specific about it and wants to know about the issue of critical race theory, which was obviously kicked around in that gubernatorial race, and whether it's really having an impact. Is it something that do you think will become politically potent as an issue?
I think the Republicans are already using it and have been really for months. Critical race theory is not taught in Virginia schools. I'm not sure that it's taught anywhere in the country, but it doesn't matter that it's not taught there.
Graduate schools and law schools, I think.
I'm sorry?
I think it's taught in graduate schools and law schools, isn't it?
I don't know the answer, but I can tell you it's not taught in Virginia. But that didn't stop Republicans from making it their seminal issue. They're quite skilled at focusing on a non-issue and creating it, turning it into a big issue. Now, what the Republicans have at their beck and call to do that is a media empire in Fox News, in Newsmax, and OAN, which have broadcast on this issue relentlessly because they believe it's a useful tool. Now, it's not any coincidence that this useful tool to try to win elections is based on race. It is a different form of using race to try to divide people and use cultural wedge issues to win elections. It's part of a long-standing Republican playbook. So yes, I expect to see it used elsewhere. In that sense, the Virginia governor's race was a kind of a trial run, a proof of concept. In the last cycle, it was socialism and defund the police. Those arguments and attacks will persist, but I think critical race theory will be a new and increasingly important part of their arsenal. It means the Democrats are going to have to fight back. We're going to have to anticipate those attacks in every race, even as I say, in places where it's never been taught, never would be taught. And we're going to have to overcome the media advantage the Republicans have because they essentially have state-run TV in Fox. There's nothing equivalent on the Democratic side of the aisle, which means we're going to have to be more thoughtful and disciplined and tough and strategic with our messaging, both to make the positive case, which I think will be very strong when we get these two big bills passed, the biggest investment in the American people since the New Deal. But we're also going to have to go right at them as being the party of QAnon, the party of the Marjorie Taylor Greens and Matt Gaetzes and whatnot, because that has now become a core part of the Republican base. And that needs to be exposed to the American people.
What do your colleagues in Congress tell you about that, about those kinds of appeals? And are they in fact fearful that if they attack QAnon or criticize that those very extreme points of view, they'll be primaried? Is that what they're worried about?
They're worried that they'll be primaried, and they're worried that this is now an important and growing part of the Republican base. That those that adhere to these crazy conspiracy theories, many of which are new and even more bizarre derivatives of old bigotries. I did a forum like this, for example, with Jason Alexander in Pasadena, and we had QAnon protesters outside the church where that event was taking place, pushing their same Democrats are pedophiles, socialists, etc. You probably saw there was a group of people in Dallas, QAnon supporters gathered for some crazy conspiracy theory about JFK returning this year. This is an important part now of the Republican base, and they don't feel they can alienate it because they need the votes of these QAnon people. And an increasing number of QAnon people are running for Congress on the Republican ticket. Indeed, astonishingly, I suppose at one level, not surprising at another, people who were part of the insurrection, people that were there on the mall that day are running for Congress, and that is their credential, that they participated in that day of insurrection.
I think we are out of time, but let me remind people, first of all, that your book is titled Midnight in Washington, How We Almost Lost Democracy and Still Could. The sponsors of the program always like to give you an opportunity to say something positive at the end of the program. So let me ask you to do that.
Well, Warren, I'm glad that's the tradition, because I would hate to end on the note that I just struck. I do want to tell people why I'm optimistic about the future, notwithstanding the darkness of the present moment. The reason I titled the book Midnight in Washington is midnight may be the darkest moment of the day everywhere in the world, and it is. But it's also a hopeful time because what follows holds the prospect of light. We're going to get through this. The country is enormously resilient. We've been through other more difficult times in the past, and this too shall pass. But what's key right now is what we do in this moment. And I don't mean just in Congress, what all of us do in our public life, our private life, our corporate and civic life. What we do in this moment will determine how quickly we get through this period of time and how quickly we get to the other side. But we will get there. It's difficult sometimes when you're in crisis to see how it ends or even if it ends, but it does end, and this will end. So I don't want people to be in despair about it. And what I would suggest to people humbly is don't try to worry about everything. Don't try to do everything. Just decide, here's the one thing I'm going to do in the next year and a half to make a difference in the life of my country. We can't all be Marie Ivanovich, first through the breach, but we can all figure out a way to make a contribution in our own lives. And that's what we need to do. And one day we'll look back on this as a terrible gauntlet we had to run, but one we ran and emerged on the other side.
Adam Schiff, a Democratic congressman and author. Let me just say for the record that the book is fascinating. It's a wonderful read and very hard to put down, as was said earlier. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Next week, the program will feature Steve Schmidt, a political maven he's described as in the literature. That's as good as any, I think. And he will be in conversation with USC's Bob Shrum, who is director of the Center for Political Future. And they'll be discussing the political future. Thanks to all of you who have been watching today. Thanks very much, of course, to those who sponsor America at a Crossroads. I'm Olney. Great to be with you.